So a very good early morning to everyone with us today, and welcome to the day after the day before. This is where our Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana delivered his maiden budget, and his well-cut suit with its matching tie and pocket square revealed his sartorial sensibilities. But did his budget deliver a well-measured and tailored cutting of the cloth to suit our economic suit, or to fit our economic suit? So in this Budget Day event brought to us by BDO, we're going to be taking a focused look at what this means for business and society so that you can begin to chart a clear way through. Please do feel free to ask questions throughout the session, and I'm going to do my best to make sure we get some answers to those. I'm going to introduce our panelists to you and tell you what to expect from today's program in just a moment. But first, I'd like you to look at our opening poll question where you get to rate this budget. What you can do is go into the chat. You'll see a little Menti code. Take the code and put it in menti.com. And please do rate this budget for us. I think I'll give it a couple of minutes while we get some opening remarks from our panelists to see what it is you thought. So we have gathered some of the sharpest minds in the room to appraise this all-important budget, which comes at a critical time for our country. And I don't need to tell you this, you already know the numbers. Our growth is expected to soften at around 2% or even a touch less this year, depending on who you're talking to. We've already got constrained power supply, and that, of course, is putting a lot of pressure on business. We are still very, very worried about jobs, and the outlook on that front is not good. Global demand is slowing down, and as one of my colleagues, Mamokgethi Malapiane, writes, yes, South Africa is in economic decline. The prospects of a turnaround in our lifetime are remote. Accept it and move on. Well, how we move on depends on whether we are making the right choices and taking the right action. So did we yesterday? Did this budget hit the spot? So I'm going to turn that question over to our panel as a way of setting the scene, and here is who's with us today. I'm going to start to my left, and it's David Wanica, who's one of your very own, head of technical tax here at BDO, and he leads the tax consulting division in the Western Cape, and he's also the adjunct associate professor in tax at the University of Cape Town, and also chair of SAICA's National Tax Committee and member of the Tax Court. And David has got a lot of experience in the taxation of corporations, trusts, and individuals. Then I have Kevin Lings, who over the last 10 years, his scope of economic research is broadening now to include the G3 economies. That's an issue that we're going to touch on as well in our discussion this morning, as well as members of the BRICS. And his research is largely used to inform Stanlib's asset management investment processes. I know it's not entirely relevant to our conversation today, but he's a keen photographer. I didn't know that until exactly today. And he's got his licentiateship, darling, from the Royal Photographic Society. So he's going to give us some really beautiful pictures of our economic album this morning. And then Hassan Munir, and of course Hassan is also well-known senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg, and he lectures taxation to honours and CTA students. He's also a member of the SAICA National Tax Committee and a member of the SAIT External Integrated Summative Assessment Committee. He's a CA, holds a master's in South African and international tax. And then someone as well who is no stranger to these discussions, Gina Skuman, who's Managing Director, Economist, and Head of CEMEA Economics and South African Research for Citibank South Africa. And she's been at Citibank for 8 years, started in London in 2012, and was the lead economist at one time at Barclays Capital, ABSA Capital. And she is, as you know, consistently top-rated in local and global analyst ratings. Very passionate about mentoring young people and promoting transformation in this particular field. So welcome to all of you.
Thank
and it's
you.
really lovely to have you with us this morning. Let's maybe just start with a snap take on your overall perceptions and impressions of yesterday. David, we'll kick off with you. Did it hit the spot?
Yes, and good morning to everybody. I think that largely it was what I was expecting. Revenue has overshot the medium budget forecast. I think everyone believed that that would happen, and so it did. As a result of windfalls, which I'm sure Gina and Kevin will talk more about later. From a tax point of view, I didn't expect there to be any increases in personal income tax. We already are one of the most highly taxed from PRT point of view in the world as a percentage of GDP. I didn't expect increases there, so we got the 4.5% rate reduction, which I'm sure we'll also speak about later. Corporate income tax the 1% reduction has been promised for a while as part of a broader package, which has got some negatives to it as well. So I think all of that was expected, and I think given our imperative of long-term sustainable growth, I don't think from a personal point of view that there was much more that the minister could have done, certainly in respect of tax changes. Maybe one can talk about expenditure and so forth, but insofar as tax, that was pretty much what I was expecting.
Thanks for that, David. Kevin?
Yeah, I think it did what we were expecting. It wasn't the most exciting budget, right?
Budget and exciting, two words I never thought would meet.
No, so if you're changing taxes a lot, right? So let's say that you were cutting taxes dramatically, you'd get a lot of interest and a lot of attention paid to the budget. And equally, if you're putting up the VAT rate, you'll get some reaction. So the fact that there weren't big tax changes does dampen down an potentially exciting budget. But in terms of the decisions he made, I thought they were in line with the expectations. They were what he ought to make. So I wouldn't disagree with the broad focus. And the broad focus was fiscal consolidation, or what we would call fiscal discipline. That has to be there. And I know that sounds quite boring, and it sounds perhaps like it's not the thing we should focus on, given that we don't have much economic growth going on in the country. But you've got to understand just how indebted we've become over the last few years, and that you have to put the debt in better shape. The debt servicing cost has ballooned to almost 20% of total tax revenue, and you just can't sustain that. You can't pay that much money on interest cost and then do everything else. So the focus was very much fiscal consolidation, fiscal discipline, and I'd give him full marks for that in terms of the direction he's put us on. And then I think he said, look, I don't want to add to the tax burden that households and businesses are facing. He recognizes that the economy is struggling, that we need to get the recovery more embedded. And so he didn't want to add to that, which I thought was exactly right. He can't go around giving us massive tax breaks because ultimately he needs the money. So I thought he did pretty much what he can. I think it will please investors. I think it will please credit rating agencies. I think we'll give this a tick. I don't think we're going to get a credit rating upgrade, so don't think they're going to rush out and upgrade us, but they'll acknowledge that this is a move in the right direction. The other interesting thing is it's pretty much exactly in line with what the IMF put out as a recommendation earlier this month. So the IMF did an investigation of South Africa, and they put forward some suggestions on what should be in the budget and how government should approach this, exactly in line with what the IMF was suggesting. So I thought it was good, solid, encouraging. What's the gap? There's no damn growth. So what we're not realizing in this country is that all of this is just kind of financial engineering. We're kind of playing with the numbers, we're moving some money around, we're tinkering with taxes, we're trying to be disciplined. But the key thing that we're not getting right at all is where the hell is the economic growth going to come from? Yeah. And if you look at his own budget, right, his own numbers, what is he saying? He's listened to the State of the Nation address. He's listened to all the ministers brag about all their intentions. And he's putting in his own budget economic growth of less than 2% over the next couple of years. So he's saying that I don't think all of this rhetoric that he's hearing, the State of the Nation, all the bragging, he's saying, I don't think that's going to result in growth of more than 2%.
Right. Hold that thought for me, Kevin, because I want to deep dive on some of those themes that you've just highlighted. But I saw you nodding a lot, Munir, at some of the points that Kevin was making, especially when it comes to what happens from a social perspective vis-a-vis taxes. What are your thoughts on whether you believe, as everyone is saying this morning, this was a budget of some hope and mostly stability?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Iman. I think, if I unpack what's positive in the budget, and if we look from a tax point of view, whenever we have no increases, that's a good budget. We stand back as tax people and say that's a good budget because no increases is a good sign. If we look at the big three, so we always look at personal income tax, there's some sort of relief coming back, which is good. good news for the taxpayers. I must still stress at the higher end, the wealthy taxpayers are still going to feel the pinch because they're going to be beaten on inflation. So if you look at the rate of what the bracket creep gives back versus inflation, they're going to be eaten up a little bit. Then if we look at VAT, I said it pre-budget. If VAT goes up, I'll eat humble pie. I couldn't see it coming. It was not the time to do it, and I think the minister said that as well. It's not the time to raise taxes. Coming back to company tax, so he follows through on the then Minister of Finance, Tito Mbowene's statement last year to decrease taxes, which is good, I think, because it shows policy carried through and consistency. It also shows that the policy is coming through and they acting on what they're actually saying. However, having said that, we have a decrease of 1%, but remember, together with that, we have a broadening of the tax base on the same effective date, where we're going to basically kick in the so-called restriction of assessed losses, which I might add actually is going to increase the tax base even further than the 1%. So to contextualize it, I think companies are actually going to pay more tax than what they're going to, than the relief they're going to actually achieve through that 1%. Something I dig particularly...
Do you want to tease that point out just a little bit more?
Yes, so I think if we look at, if you basically just look at the 1% that they're going to save, and that's not a big number. If we just look at Treasury's numbers on that, I think it was something like 2.6 billion that they mentioned that they're giving back in terms of the 1% rate cut reduction. But if we look at what that rule, the reduction or the restriction of assessed losses is going to do. Remember, your assessed losses that's brought forward from the prior year, and I'm really putting it simple, it's more complex than this. You can only offset it going forward against 80% of your taxable income. And what they do quite smartly also, if you look at the detail, is they know that there's quite a lot of uptake in the mining sector recently. We've seen that come true. We've seen that they're overshooting on the budget, on the collections, the 180 billion, particularly because of the improvement in the mining sector. So they circle back and they say, hang on, we're going to have a look at that assessed loss restriction in relation to the mining companies. And remember, with mining companies, they've got this big so-called capex development expenditure that comes through as deductions yearly. And they make a comment in the budget statement that they're going to relook as to whether that is going to form part of your taxable income this year or not. So they're quite smart in terms of, I think, they've seen the carrot, they've seen the money's coming through on the mining side, and they're saying, hang on, we're going to put through a technical amendment and we're going to actually watch this carefully to see whether we can actually extract more from the mining in the form of taxes.
So hold that thought for me, because obviously everyone who is listening is way cleverer than I am, and you'd have better follow-up questions on this point than I have. So please feel free to post those questions in the chat, but also if you're in the room, just make a note of things that you want to come back to our panel on, and by all means feel free to ask. So let's put a pause on that really quickly. Gina.
So I'm going to pick up on the point of a good budget is where we don't hike taxes. Do you realize how we've got stuck in this mindset of expecting revenue to underperform, expecting expenditure to overperform, and so we naturally just expect that the only place to get revenue from is from taxes, and we've run out of that as a revenue channel. So a good budget should not be one where we actually just relieved that we didn't get tax hikes. A good budget should be one where we actually see the prudence or the cautious nature of Treasury coming through alongside with exactly what Kevin said. Government facilitating more growth so that the revenue base, the tax base, can actually grow sustainably. And on that point, what I find, and I deeply empathize with National Treasury because I really think they're trying to work with whatever they can work with. But they are more, and I'm quoting, this is not my line, I'm quoting Michael Sachs, who I'm sure many people are well aware of, former head of budget at National Treasury. Treasury is a policy taker, not so much a policy maker anymore. In other words, they are doing some very clever things in the budget, not being able to expose the fact that they know down the line there are big risks. I mean, for the current year, it's fine. We had commodity prices, windfall revenue, happy days, budget smaller. Let's use half of that to reduce the borrowing cost. Let's use half of it for things such as social welfare, health, education. Effectively, let's use half of that to fund the inefficiencies of government falling down on their reform promises. We should be using all of that to reduce borrowing costs, especially if, debt servicing costs are eating away at our revenue at 20 cents per rand. So that's effectively the problem here. And I don't want to discredit National Treasury and the Finance Ministry's power within government, because they still do hold those purse strings. And I think our Finance Minister does play a very important political role in that regard. But at the end of the day, we know social grant extensions of 12 months are not going to end after 12 months.
Yeah.
We know they're going to continue after that. And that's the type of thing, I think, if you look deeper within the budget, you start to see Treasury being more mindful of that and trying to account for it in the only way they can. I am worried on a last point that while the expenditure measures Treasury's put in place are actually just realistic, even if they're in the wrong direction, I'm worried about revenue. Because I do think the revenue projections 3 years out, not that, believe me, as an economist, trying to forecast 3 years out at the moment is virtually impossible, but rather use more prudence 3 years out, so that if there is a surprise, the surprise is to the upside and not to the downside. And I'm worried about revenue down the line.
It's so curious to me. I mean, if I'm listening to all of you speak, first of all, there's some fancy footwork that Treasury must do, as you say. They're not in the driver's seat in terms of policy anymore, so that they can't really be the definers of their own destiny, but they'll play these little mind games. I mean, I'm using that term very lightly. I don't mean it like that. What I mean is making that buffer available, should things like social grants need to be bolstered. They've got a little bit of a kitty there. But it's about having some alacrity in how you account for where you're going to keep some reserves in case of a rainy day. You spoke about not creating a growth environment for this economy. We're relying on the revenue that we're able to take from from taxpayers and from business. That's not a growth mindset necessarily. You're talking about actually a red herring. Let's look a little bit deeper. That 1% saving on the swings is going to buy you, probably 2% more on the merry-go-rounds. So we have to be really critical and analytical about how we receive a budget, especially in a climate where we're in a very low growth cycle and have been for many years and are likely to continue for many years to come. So again, thank you very much for that scene set. Let's just take a couple of minutes then to really deep dive on some of the issues. And David, maybe I'll just kick off with you on this front. Munir and both of you actually talked about the corporate tax rate reduction from 28 to 27%. That's to attract FDI. Do you think it's going to have the effect of doing that?
No, I doubt it. And I think, for the reason that Munir said, I think if we're going to reduce corporate rates, reducing it by 1% isn't really going to be felt. I think they could have gone further and reduced it by 2%. Interestingly, the average corporate income tax rate for OECD countries is 23%. So we should be going in that direction. I mean, this is, very, very small, and what Munir spoke about is one part of the sort of puzzle that all fits together. So it's the 1% reduction was supposed to be done on a tax neutral basis. So in other words, they're giving back there, but then they're getting back with this assessed loss limitation rule that Munir spoke about. And there's another rule, which is that interest that is paid to basically connected persons who are not subject to full tax, often non-residents, for example, that those rules are also going to be tightened, and that's also part of this whole package that binds together. So revenue's taking away there, they're taking away the assessed losses, and they're giving in exchange a 1% reduction in the corporate rate of tax. And I think the 1% could have been higher. And I don't know that it's going to, in any case, encourage. I don't think foreign companies are going to look and say, "Oh, we'll go there because it's only 27 and it's not 28." I can't really see that realistically happening either.
So maybe then, just to tag on that point, what would have been changes that would make the our investment profile more favorable from a tax perspective?
I think it's more about, I think to make us more advantageous from an investment perspective, there are a lot of other structural changes that need to happen. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty that needs to be removed. So if you look long term, obviously we've got the political uncertainty. You know, that's a major factor. You know, we've got labor market inflexibility. And these are all very difficult issues that are very difficult for government to address, and they haven't been addressed for years and years and years. I think those are the types of things that are going to encourage, you know, there are lots of others. There's state-owned entities that are very inefficient and that are crowding out investment in the economy. We've got a lot of red tape. And so there are moves in the right direction, you know. But we need to see more implementation and not just rhetoric. We need to see things actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
No, I've never come across a foreigner say, I would invest in South Africa if only the tax system was better. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
I've heard foreigners say, I'd invest in this country if you had electricity. So there are other much bigger issues. And once you've dealt with those issues, then yes, delve into the tax and see whether that's a stumbling block, or certain sectors could be promoted through a different tax structure in say, mining or manufacturing, or you could do a little bit more. But there's so many other, as David mentioned, so many other big issues. The reduction in corporate tax isn't going to change the environment.
So those issues are eclipsing that concession. I see you had a comment as
I
well.
was going to say something quite similar. I mean, just imagine yourself as a big multinational and you're looking around the world and you're going, well, are we going to go for the country with the lower corporate tax rate, or are we looking at exactly all those other things? You know, what's happening to labor markets? What's happening to energy? All of that you need to offset, especially if you're an exporter then, with a weaker currency to gain the competitiveness. It's just difficult. You know, you've got to, it's one of many factors when trying to make a particularly 10 plus year investment into a country, because we're talking about bricks and mortar. It's not something you can just, it's not like equities and bonds. When times get tough, you can't just pick up the factory and take it away. So you have to be very sure about the country you're moving into.
Yeah. I think towards the tail end of the conversation, we talk about an enabling environment and whether, you know, for example, SOEs, I think largely were ignored with the exception of Eskom, which is a key driver of the, you know, improving sentiment around investment in South Africa, making sure there is power to power the machines and the manufacturing and so on. So we'll come back to that one.
If I
yes,
might
absolutely.
just delve a little bit back and circle back to that point about decreasing company tax rates. There's one further issue we're forgetting, and that is there's a decrease of 1% coming through with, like David said, 2 additional broadening of the tax basis in the form of the assessed loss restrictions as well as the interest limitation. But don't forget, it's a full package, like David said. It's more complex than that. They're also going to listen to this. We look at all allowances that companies get, and there's a couple that they've already listed that they're not going to renew when the sunset clauses of those allowances kick in. So if anything, I still think that the companies are going to be, you know, that they're going to be paying more taxes come 2022.
And what's your projection on that? By how much?
You know, it's difficult. They've got the numbers, obviously. They know exactly what each allowances contribute. We don't see the numbers that come into in the detail, but they definitely got the numbers. And I think what they're going to do, Imani, is they're going to well manage it. So they're going to obviously see how much they actually need from, or how much they can actually extract from a company at each year. And they slowly, I think they're going to start re-looking at allowances that companies actually get and switching them off, to be honest. You know, if 1% is going to do anything, I don't think so. If anything, it's just trying to make South Africa a little bit more attractive. If we think about the UK, the US, they're closer to the 20% down there. They've actually, post-COVID, started to increase the tax rate. So we're still way beyond, you know, the averages that David talked about of about 23%. We're way off that marker. Yeah. And if anything, I think there's still a lot of opportunity. You know, companies will be attracted to want to actually move their taxable income to a low tax jurisdiction. Think about it. Yeah. That's what they're actually after. They're trying to ensure that companies don't go there. Because the moment you have a high tax jurisdiction and low tax jurisdiction, what companies want to do is they start to want to move their profits offshore to a lower tax jurisdiction.
All right, so that's a really interesting first round, I would say. And I want to just reflect on, well, these 47 people have voted, and the question was, did the minister's budget speech live up to your expectation? 11 out of the 47 said yes, 8 said no, and the overwhelming majority said that they were indifferent. And I'm imagining these are, people who in the audience who really have an interest in how important this budget is as both a driver of growth, but also as an opportunity, an instrument to improve the investment environment in South Africa. So that for me is concerning, that there seems to be that kind of negativity. And we can probably just tap into that a little bit later as well. Just some comments from people who are watching and in our audience. Mardeliana Santana says, once again, the budget did nothing about changing the retirement rate tables, and this has not happened in the last few years. Are people retiring, not being prejudiced? We can maybe just bookmark that and come back to that question. And Peter says, my focus is narrow. The minister erred. The minister failed to see and to use this budget as a tool for public health. You were mentioning this in our offline discussion around the NHI, that there was no mention made about that. Tax on a packet of 20 cigarettes increased by 1 rand and 3 cents. On the existing tax rate, that's an increase of 5.5. But on a retail selling price of, say, 35 rand, it's a paltry 2.9%, which is way below inflation. So cigarettes effectively become cheaper. It's quite a long comment, Peter, so I'm going to hold it on that point. But I think the point that you're all making, and I think that a lot of South Africans and people in business need to make, is that we have to, in this environment, begin to look a lot more critically and analytically at things that are profit to us. We have to deep dive on some of the issues to see where some of the structural impediments might be. Was it really great or was it not great? And begin to be a lot more critical about our environment. All right, so let's come back then to you, Gina. We had a lot going for us in this budget. We had a bumper tax revenue. The commodity price cycle also gave us a surprise gift. You talked about it there. But the minister said this improved revenue performance is not a reflection of an improvement in the capacity of our economy. It has brought us time. You alluded to what we should be doing with this time and money that it's brought us. Maybe just expound a little bit more on that.
Yes, absolutely. So, a windfall tax revenue amount is something you're not expecting, right? So it's outperformed your expectations. And they've said that they're going to use this pretty equally, split between reducing the borrowing costs, so trying to reduce those debt service costs and how much they're eating away at revenue. So again, 20 cents for every 1 rand of revenue you're getting. But only half of it is being used for that. The other half is being used to basically plug the gaps of the inefficiencies that government has created by not doing enough for growth. And I do think we need to be very careful here. As South Africans, we've become accustomed to expecting National Treasury to be responsible for growth. If you think back to the Zuma years, there was no economic planning. So National Treasury, and thank goodness for that, naturally just absorbed that as their role within the economy. They were the ones that came up with the reform measures and the reform ideas. It's not their job. Their job is to look at those reform and economic planning ideas from government and then tell government we can or cannot afford them. And government then saying, okay, we understand you. And then they're supposed to work together. So I think we must be very careful about expecting a budget to come up with solutions for growth. A budget should be there as a handbrake, especially right now, against the wants coming out of government versus what we actually can afford. And again, the revenue windfall, rather use that to reduce the massive interest cost burden we have at the moment, which, it's money just going nowhere. It's money that would be spent otherwise so much more efficiently if we didn't have that level of debt. So I think we have to be very careful there. And just one other point, not to get too off this subject, but I hear it a lot, and I think when we're talking about the corporate income tax rate, for example, let's steer clear from comparing South Africa to the likes of the UK and the US and developed markets. We are an emerging market. And it doesn't mean that our corporate tax rate, for example, that's just one example, isn't necessarily still too high. We must still remember that we're an emerging market. We can attract FDI because emerging markets typically grow. They grow far quicker than developed markets, but we're not providing that growth. And that's what's setting us aside from attracting FDI.
That's actually an interesting distinction because, as you say, if you're looking at markets that are saturated, so the growth margins will probably be lower in those markets. But here you are sitting on a potential bonanza. So, you can kind of waive the corporate tax regime and say, I'm going to make so much exponential growth, so it kind of mitigates against the cost of that. Because I know that we did compare South Africa's, tax corporate rates to other countries. Would you concur with what Gina's just said?
Yeah,
Like
look,
looking at it more holistically.
I don't know realistically if you're going to get down to or we should get down to the same rate as the UK, for example. Difficulty that one often though experiences, and one can't really compete with them, is, for example, Mauritius, where people say, well, shouldn't I rather set up in Mauritius rather than South Africa? So often, when one gets contacted by foreign investors and they look at sort of entry points into Africa, and we sort of, one of the great things we have got going for us here is that we still got great infrastructure, and we should really be levering off that. But we can't realistically compete, I don't think, on tax rate alone. So I think it comes down to these other structural issues, really, for FDI.
I'm going to later we'll talk about port congestion. We'll talk about missing rail. We'll talk about the things that do impede infrastructure and commodity. Things moving across the South African business landscape. But just to bring it into perspective, the point Gina was raising was our government debt projected to hit 4.35 trillion in 2021-22. Our debt to GDP is going to stabilize at 75.1% in the 2024-25 financial year, instead of a year later as had been previously forecast. And this anyone can take, really. Is this one of the signs of hope, maybe, that we've been looking for, or no? Munir?
Iman, I just want to come back to the point of expenditure, and I fully agree with Gina as well. What we've seen is we've got a windfall, but don't forget that those targets are suppressing anyway. We're coming out of a COVID pandemic. So to shoot the lights out of a target is very easy, actually. So we got 180 billion extra collected, but it's against a mediocrity target. It wasn't a stretch target by any chance. Then I think if we look at I always said that we don't have a revenue problem. We actually have an expenditure problem, because the expenses were going out of control. And what did they do in this budget? Same old. Consolidation of expenditure, which is good. There's nothing wrong with consolidating your expenditure. But what did they fail to do? Last year they mentioned zero-based budgeting, right? A principle in accounting that we teach in the universities. And what that says is that if you have a disruption in your business, you don't do business as usual. And they are doing business as usual. They're taking last year's budget, they're smacking on a little bit of inflation, they're consolidating, they're realigning expenditure, but you have to go back to the drawing board. Yesterday, it was reported in the media, the police and security underspent their budget by 10 billion, right? What happened in yesterday's budget? We increased the police budget again. Yet most departments have actually underspent their budgets. So the point is that if this was a real business, what would the CEO of the company, what would the financial manager have done? They would have gone back to their spenders and said, you need to motivate for every cent that you're going to actually want going forward. Because we're starting the business from a zero base and then working upward. And for government, unfortunately, to do that, it's a very difficult thing. And I think they mentioned it in the budget papers last year, which was good. They actually spoke about zero-based budgeting, and they didn't follow it through.
And this is a capacity problem. So nationally, we're okay. Then you move provincially and you move municipally, and trying to find accountability at those levels is unfortunately incredibly difficult.
Well, what's going to, again, if I think back, and I've been with BDO and these conversations for quite a while now, a few years, I think, in conversation with you in different platforms for quite a few years as well. I hear the same thing. It's that disconnect between what we need to be doing and what we are actually doing, chasmic disconnect. So what's going to change? I mean, if we've not been in a crisis before, what's going to shift the needle?
So throwing money at the problem ain't going to solve the problem, right? Let's go back to what Gina said. You had 180 billion, and you used half of that to reduce debt. You should have used more of it. Now, imagine they took the 180 billion and they threw it at government expenditure, and they said, we're going to allocate a whole lot more money to every government department, and we're going to boost this economy. We're going to get more hospitals, more schools. Everybody would be, that's great, that's excellent. And then we would have underperformed because we can't deliver on that. So it's very clear that we've lost institutional capacity. At every department, we just don't have the skills, the experience, the management to make that function. So it's part of the bigger problem. And you've got to be actively improving that. And if you look at a company, if there's a department in a company that's underperforming, how do you improve it? You need management to step in. Who's management? The president, the cabinet. They've got to be much more engaged in the performance of this economy than they are now. They've got to be much more accountable than they are at the moment. So we have weak management at the most senior level in government, and therefore you're getting weak delivery in every government department. It's got to change. What I think was good is the minister recognizes that. He won't admit it, but he recognizes it because he's not willing to throw more money. Every government department wants more money. They don't explain what they're going to do with it, but they want the more money. The minister's saying, I'm just not going to give you the money. I can't just keep giving salaries. He's at least sending that message back to government. Government's not listening. And each government department needs to reform way more than they are at the moment.
I mean, what's your sense on just buying time before, something inevitable happens in our economy? In the sense that we have, we heard his sentiments on the public sector wage bill. There are hints that there might be a headcount reduction, somewhere later on. Of course, that's going to rile up the unions as it typically will. In a sense, a real storm is going to come a little bit later. Would you agree with that assessment, Gina?
Like a bit of looting, maybe.
A little bit of what?
Looting, a little bit of looting here and there.
The public sector wage bill is a far more complex issue than I think we realize. It's not to say that it's going to, so we've relatively contained it versus what we were used to in the past. So in other words, we've arrested the wage increases. They still creep up a little bit, but they don't look anything like the wage increases of the past. Okay, so let's give credit there. Treasury's tried very hard. What falls short here is that Treasury has a budget, but they don't negotiate. The Department of Public Administration negotiates. So if they don't negotiate according to that budget and they let a little bit slip through, then Treasury has to find a way to pay for it. So that's one of the problems here. The second problem is, sure, you can maybe give an ultimatum that if it doesn't come out, you'll cut headcount. Will we cut headcount in a very big way that will make a big difference to the wage bill given the political climate? Probably not. So you get almost more what they call stealth mode headcount reduction. And Treasury mentioned this in the MTBPS last year, where if a more expensive senior individual within government, when they retire or leave, they will then replace them with a cheaper, more junior person. That sounds like a great strategy, but ask yourself if already with the senior individuals we are running an effective government. So why would we be more effective if we have someone less experienced and cheaper replacing them? So that's also not effectively a solution here. Then when you come to the unions, this is where it gets really interesting and a very a critical thing to monitor over coming years. If you watch various unions within South Africa, some of them seem to be becoming a bit more constructive. In other words, coming to the table, trying to come up with ideas on how to help. One example was Kasaju coming up with a debt solution for Eskom. Let's give credit. Why not? Everyone's trying to find a solution. That was a couple of years ago. But what's effectively happening in the trade unions, and this is why they care so much about employment, is because their membership base is stagnating, if not decreasing, and getting older. If youth unemployment is anywhere between 60 and 75%, depending on how you measure it, how are they going to attract youngsters to join their membership base? So the average age of a union member is getting older. And they can't attract a lot of individuals to join their union if unemployment is becoming worse and worse and worse.
So do you see it as a real threat then?
Well, so they're desperate for relevance. The question is, which unions see what's happening and try and use that constructively to move away from that old, we just want higher wages, to more constructive, trade unions are important in an economy, but now they become the bad guy in South Africa. The trade unions are there to make sure that, job retention is there, job quality is there. It's not just always about wages at CPI plus. And some unions are becoming a bit more constructive because they can see the writing on the wall. Other unions are so desperate that they're screaming out louder. So that is going to be very difficult to watch within, especially the public sector space going forward.
Yeah. We'll come back to some of the tax issues and a kind of I hate the term, stay of execution, if you will, on, on the fuel price levy, on VAT, on personal income tax, and we'll get there in just a second. But I really just want to throw it open to the audience at this juncture. Is there anyone in the room who would love to ask a question or even just make a comment? And you're more than welcome to share your observations. I'll go to some observations from our online audience. And Yusuf says, speeches are always good and positive, but where's the will of politicians to implement? To the point that I think you and Kevin had made. The taxpayer will always be hit, especially salary earners are always overtaxed. It will never change. It's the easiest source of revenue. And Ernesto Ciccone says, with a shrinking tax base, how do we get the goals the panel is hoping for? And it ties into a question I want to ask about, are we just delaying the inevitable insofar as when we have to pay for things that this budget, is not going to be able to cover? Anyone in the room? Don't all rush at once. Okay, no questions in the room. So I think you're doing a really great job of keeping everyone totally engaged. Okay. Let's come back. Kevin and I want to just widen our aperture a little bit and look at, and you touched on this in your opening, around how we view, just from a sentiment point of view globally, as, a great investment destination. I know, David, you were saying, they look at us, they look at Mauritius and think, I'll go to Mauritius and maybe better beaches and no problems with sewage being pumped into the ocean.
And a 15% flat rate tax across the board in Mauritius.
Actually, we should talk about the competitiveness and maybe looking to Mauritius as some kind of guide on how we can do it better. I'll come back to that point, Munir. But I was looking and trying to do a scan this morning on how credit ratings might be viewing this budget. You mentioned some signs earlier on. Maybe just again take us into that universal perspective on what we're being rated at this time round and how we fare in terms of favorability in investment.
So obviously the credit rating agencies all have us below investment grade. We've been below investment grade now for a while. What has started to happen is that since Cyril's been president, the rating agencies have eased up on the negative criticism. And recently, Fitch adjusted the ratings outlook for South Africa from negative to stable. So that was the first inclination that we're moving in the right direction. And I think this budget will add to that. So I think we got no more credit rating downgrades ahead in the short term. I think that's off the table. And I think what you'll see from the rating agencies is more appetite to be positive, more willingness to put in a positive outlook, not a ratings upgrade, but hint that if these policies are implemented, if this fiscal consolidation is made effective, then in time we could see a ratings upgrade, right? And it's going to take us a long time to get back to investment grade. Remember, rating agencies take you down very quickly, and then they take an awful long time to take you back up because they need to be sure that when they upgrade you, that this is sustainable. So we're going to have to do...
What time frame does that involve? Just
how
hard
it is... The average is 8 years once you lose your investment grade credit rating. It takes you 8 years to get back to that. That's the average. Some countries have done it in 2 years. So, if you go back to South Korea, they lost the investment grade credit rating. They responded amazingly. It's a brilliant example of how to respond. And I think they got it in about 18 months back to investment grade. Yeah. They're the exception. Many countries take a lot longer. And obviously, I think we're more in the 8-year camp than the 2-year camp, right? Because it's pretty much been already 2 years. So it's a long process of getting back to investment grade. Now, the budget itself will help that a lot. And you mentioned earlier on, should the fact that the debt level looks like it's going to top out at 75% of GDP, should we take that as a positive? And the answer is yes, but let me take you back to 2009. 2008, 2009, Trevor Manuel was Minister of Finance. He was on his way to the Planning Commission, right? He was going to plan. And when he left, South Africa's credit rating by Moody's was an A-rated. We were A-rated by Moody's. Government debt was 25% of GDP. Now we want to get excited because it's 75%, right? So we've had this massive deterioration for no gain, because what's happened while we've gone from 25% debt to GDP to 75%, what's happened? Our growth rate has slumped and our unemployment rate has soared. So we've taken on all of this debt for no gain. That's the inefficiency that Gina talks about. So where we should be happy is that not long ago we were thinking Instead of 75, we were thinking government debt's going to be 90% of GDP, and we're on our way to 100%. So we've at least arrested that crisis. And it would have been a massive crisis and a failed state type of scenario. So at least we're on the better path. But we've got a lot of work to do to get it to a level where the rating agencies are going to say, okay, I'm very comfortable. Now, do the rating agencies just focus on the budget and just focus on the debt levels? Not at all. And the missing ingredient is growth. We're not going to go back to investment grade if there's no economic growth, because the rating agencies can see the looting. They can see the social pressure. They can see the social grants. They can see the wage increases. And the rating agencies are going to say, if you don't have growth, you're just going to repeat the social anguish on a perpetual basis, and that represents a massive risk to the stability of the country. Forget the government debt situation. So it's not good enough to just do what the minister did, control the fiscal consolidation, fiscal discipline. It has to be accompanied by an impressive growth story. And we don't have that story. And we think the Minister of Finance is somehow miraculously going to deliver that growth story.
Yeah.
He ain't going to do it.
And just, to Kevin's point, that's the backbone here, is that if we have a budget twice a year to explain government finances, we should have a growth symposium to hold government accountable for the reform measures they put in place and track them. I mean, we've tried. The number of spreadsheets I've had through the years of trying to track reform promises, economic planning, I can't even begin to list. But just to get back to the rating agencies, if you look at the way they structure South Africa's credit score, it's economic growth, it's institutions, and it's fiscal strength. There's also this thing called susceptibility to event risk, but it's broadly those three. And it's the pull down in fiscal that was, and remember, we started getting downgraded in 2012.
Yeah.
People forget that.
Yeah.
We only made it a big thing when we were suddenly on the cusp of junk,
Yeah.
right?
And
From
junk.
about 2018 onwards. But it's the fiscal score that's pulled us so far down, which should actually etch up now, because those were the years where we kept pushing out that debt to GDP ratio. We kept pushing out debt stabilization. Now that picture starts looking better, so exactly what Kevin's saying, we probably will move to a stable outlook, even from Moody's, who seems to be the most bearish of the lot. But you can't get upgraded without the growth.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. And I wanna dedicate a whole band maybe to, as you say, it lies outside of his purview. It has to be in that concentric circle immediately outside of Treasury and outside of the finance instruments. But I want to come back to this question around, as I said, we haven't done anything on VAT increases this cycle round. We haven't done anything on personal income tax. But if we had to find money for things in the future, if we had any unforeseen expenses, those are obviously the first places that are going to be targeted. And I don't know if you have a time frame in mind when you've got your hand up.
So, Iman, thanks. They mentioned, and they actually put numbers to it yesterday in the budget detail, that if we increase, and they've done it, don't forget they've done this in the past. We've just increased the individual wealth tax. We went from a bracket of 40% to 45%. And that helped us a bit, but it wasn't really sustainable. To be honest, what the wealthy done is they looked at structures and they looked at minimizing the taxes legally, maybe, and they've actually paid less taxes, so it wasn't sustainable. It's short term. When you look at that's a regressive tax, isn't it? It affects everybody. It's not progressive like income tax, where you pay more as you earn more, you're going to pay more. VAT affects everybody in the street. And if we just think about it, that they mentioned yesterday that if they're going to look at increases, they're going to come back to the golden goose, and that's personal income tax. That is VAT. A 2% increase in personal income tax will give them approximately 50 billion, and a further 2% in VAT is going to give them another 50 billion. So there we go. They've got 100 billion stacked up. The simplest thing to do...
Watch me gasp for air.
The simplest thing to do is to increase taxes, and there we go. They can get, they can fund the 350 rand, which I think, Kevin and Gina said, it's going to be with us forever. It's not a 12-month problem. It's actually it's a long fixed problem that we're going to have. And I do think that now was not the time to increase taxes. But in the near future, when things start settling, when that comes under control, 70% of GDP, when we start bringing that level down, because another number to watch is tax to GDP ratio. Because if we're sitting at the highest at the moment. I think yesterday in the papers it was mentioned at about 25%. It's the highest we've ever seen, your tax to GDP ratio. Now that's the level of measure. It tells you the maximum you can extract from your tax-paying community. And history has shown 26% is the highest you can go to. And we're already at 25%. And if you get sensitive to that number, what happens is you get a lot of people leaving the country, right? Because they're going to simply go to
That's a point you touched on.
You're going to go
as well.
to better places.
This is what we call the Laffer curve in economics. And not to get too technical with all of you, if any of you remember your economics textbooks. But you get to a point where you've taxed so much that actually tax revenue starts to slip off. And this is why I cannot see aggressive tax hikes in an economy that's not growing, because we've been taxed over a period where the economy has done worse and the tolerance for tax has dropped considerably. So in other words, what I'd love to know from the two of you as tax experts, if we look forward 10 years in South Africa and we assume nothing changes and we continue to see high income individuals emigrating, our tax base will look structurally very different to what it does today.
Very different.
You cannot then rely on personal income tax. So what do you do?
We've got 133,000 individuals in the 45% bracket. 130,000 individuals who contribute to 20 to 30% of the total personal income tax collections. That's a small group of people, and it's sensitive, like Gina is saying. So we've got to be very careful how we manage it. But I just want to mention something about the VAT, because you mentioned VAT as well. Yes, we didn't increase VAT, and I'm all with it. But don't forget, they didn't increase fuel levy for the first time since 1990. Good news story, and I think we all applauded that. But don't forget, sugar tax has gone up, carbon tax has gone up, your smokes, your sin taxes have gone up. What is that, Iman? That's all consumption taxes, right? And that's a hidden form of putting up VAT without you actually realizing that.
You know when you've got your kid at the dinner table and it looks like their plate is empty, but the peas are under the plate and the meat is in the glass, kind of that scenario. But David, it sounded like you also wanted to come in on that point.
Yeah, I just also want to say that I think that the minister does realize the issue around the Laffer curve, because in the budget review documents it was pointed out there that the previous increase, when the top rate went from 41 to 45, didn't bring in nearly as much revenue as they were anticipating.
Yeah.
And they said because people change their behavior, they then think, well, what's the point of working if I'm going to pay so much tax? I might as well not work overtime. I might as well not put in the extra mile.
Yeah.
Or they restructure their affairs such that the taxes in the hands of a company and not them, and stuff like that. So,
how endemic is that? I mean, is there research? Is there something current that we can look at that actually says, look, this is happening? Statistically, it's happening.
Well, I don't think that it didn't appear to me that there was definite research on it, because it seemed to be broad remarks that were made. I'm sure that they have got the numbers. Treasury's got the numbers of what they believe. That they would have expected to collect and what they actually have collected from that band. But I think there isn't really scope to raise personal income taxes. Corporate income taxes on the way down globally. We can't buck the trend. It just can't happen. And so you're going to get more people emigrating. I think they realize that. I think the only thing in the future is that we're going to have to curtail expenditure.
Can I just interrupt and ask David, just chat about a wealth tax. How realistic would that be, and would it raise any revenue?
Well, quite an interesting development yesterday was that it was announced that individuals with assets of more than 50 million rand in future on the statement of assets and liabilities are going to have to record them at market value, not at cost. So that's part of the research that is required to be done in order to determine, the base on which a wealth tax could be levied. We've already got wealth taxes. We've already got estate duty. We've got donations tax. We've got property taxes, which are all a form of wealth taxes. To introduce yet another wealth tax, I don't know. I think it's ill-advised. A lot of countries have tried it. Almost all of them have found that it collects very little in practice, and after a few years they end up unwinding the tax and ditching it.
Well, part of it was also intended, I think, to be an instrument for the detection of fraud and tax non-compliance as well. That's what Treasury was saying. And just on that note, some of the other future tax proposals include plans for a new personal income tax regime for remote work, as well as the exemption of foreign retirement benefits in domestic tax legislation, as well as a review of depreciation and investment allowances. If anyone wants to expand on those points, you're more than welcome to do so.
No, well, if I can just come in, I also was hoping that there'd be something more around home office working expenses and deductions for that, because it's very restrictive, the regime we've got at the moment. We've got a situation where the part of your home that, if you want to claim deductions, must be used exclusively for business. And it's not practical,
I know Gina's got a home office, so you're lucky.
Not everyone has got a cordoned off area that they can say is used absolutely exclusively. And SARS is, I think, correctly applying the law as it reads at the moment, but there is a legislative amendment that would be required to change that. But I was hoping that there'd be some announcement of an amendment that would be made, rather than just a discussion paper that's going to be released sometime during the year on that. Because it has become a reality. People have been working from home for 2 years now. And it is time that we had some change in that.
I see drywall sales at Builders Warehouse going up, skyrocketing.
Iman, if I can, if I may comment on the retirement question that you had.
Absolutely.
Because a couple of things on that is that we've seen the reform come through. There's a discussion paper that's come out recent now in December, where they're looking at the two-pot system, so your ability to dip into your retirement savings because of COVID. Right, so they're going to allow, and there is discussions, they're going to consult around it. But what they're talking about there in the budget is the exit charge. So remember, when you pack up and leave, they actually want to tax you again, because they tax you at every level, as we know. And they're going to carefully look at that. And there's a lot of consultation that needs to happen around that exit charge, because when you leave, you've actually retired now, you're packing up and leaving with your retirement fund. But remember, you actually retire, and technically all this pension funding growth happen here. So they want to charge you an exit charge as you pack up and leave on your retirement as well. When you pack up and leave.
We don't have very good immigration stats in South Africa. The best you would find would be at SARS, but they don't give out financial immigration. But the concern here is that the more youngsters, and whatever age range you want to use for that have left the country, what we're concerned about is that once their empty nester parents start getting to older years, they then leave to follow their children. And that's not so much your skills drain and an income drain, that's a wealth drain then too for the country.
Yeah, and that's also, cause for concern, because we're talking about a shrinking tax base, we're talking about, more things that we need to spend money on, but we're talking about an environment that's not really conducive to growth. It really becomes a toxic mix. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we're really getting to here is that I'm sure most people don't want to leave. They only leave because of the inefficiencies that create the problems of crime, a very expensive country to live in if you don't want to use all the public services, better job potential elsewhere. So that's one thing. And this all comes down to government effectiveness again. So this is, again, it's not so much a budget discussion and how much money we spend on things. It's about the effectiveness of spending that money to generate a better way of life. And that then brings you to another interesting conversation when you start thinking about the social grant, basic income support discussion, is that there tends to be this idea that if we just throw money at people in South Africa, we'll solve so many problems. And yes, of course, if you have no money, then you'll want some money because you need some money. But I don't think we have enough understanding of how much low-income individuals actually just want a better way of life. They want
They
safer,
want access.
safer transport to work. They want better schools for their children. They want, and that's why service delivery protesting seems to be picking up more and more and more, especially in rural areas. It's also probably why a lot of urbanization is coming to Gauteng, not just in search of jobs, but because if you live in a rural area and you get water twice a week, you might eventually go, well, in Joburg I might get it 4 times a week, so I'm going there. And so service delivery and government efficiencies here is the backbone of this problem, because if you were able to correct for that, you wouldn't have to spend so much money.
Yeah, and it's not for the dearth of money, because as we've seen, there are possibilities and opportunities where you could get windfalls, or you could design for growth. You could design better for growth that will make sure that we don't sit with a problem like that, like the one that you've just raised. Okay, so let's just all take a deep breath for a second, have a nice little glass of water. I don't know if BDO didn't pay for the aircon this year, but I am sweating like a sinner in church. It's very hot, and it doesn't help that I decided to wear a woolen dress because I checked the weather report. It was going to be 16 degrees today. So the heat is on, so to speak. So please do take a drink of water. And I want to just put a second poll question to everyone in the audience. And I mean, I almost think that we have the answer to this. What will this budget spark growth and inspire confidence in South Africa for domestic and foreign investment? We've already got 25 votes in. 18 of you said no, and 7 said maybe. There's no outright yeses, and it's quite a complicated set, I suppose, and maybe it's opportune at this juncture to talk about some of the geopolitical pressures that are being put to bear that will have an impact on South Africa. It goes without saying, a lot of us would have checked our feeds this morning and seen this highly precipitous environment around the Ukraine and Russia, which technically is a war situation. What impact is that having on us?
So that's going to have a significant impact. I wouldn't underestimate it. Obviously, we don't trade a hell of a lot with that part of the world. We don't have much trade relationships directly with, say, Russia or the Ukraine. I'm not aware of any trade with the Ukraine. So the direct effect is minimal or not even there. It's the indirect effects that we would worry about. And the one is obviously the oil price. So the oil price has shot up. When I last looked, you're looking at around $100 a barrel. That is incredibly high. It's going to cause further inflation around the world, and we already have a global inflation problem, and we're starting to have an SA inflation problem. So that'll feed into us in terms of more inflation. What that'll do is it will tend to push interest rates up everywhere in the world, not just in South Africa, and it will make central banks more committed to interest rate hikes, and obviously that then has a negative effect on dampening down economic prospects. The other thing it will do is raise uncertainty in the world, right? This is a significant event that can get more out of control, and so you'll have what we call risk off, or sort of a safe haven clamor, where people decide, I don't want to be in risky assets, I'm unsure about the world, and then they disinvest. And some of that disinvestment may well apply to South Africa, because we would be regarded as a riskier investment. So the implications for financial markets, implications for inflation, implications for confidence, implications for interest rates, net, it's not a great event. And obviously what it does for us is that it's just another obstacle in our path to economic recovery. It would be very helpful if this didn't happen, if we could have an easier inflation environment and not aggressive on interest rates. That would all be much more beneficial than what this represents. So from here, you've kind of got to watch, is Putin's idea just Ukraine? And is that it? Or is it further than that? You don't know, because Putin clearly doesn't really speak the truth. And also what you don't know is, at some point, are the NATO members forced to put troops on the ground in direct retaliation? That would escalate this to another whole level and get completely out of hand from that perspective. And how does Europe deal with this? This is primarily a European problem and principally a German problem. And how do they react to it, and how effective are sanctions, and what's the fallout from that? So there's a lot we've got to look at, and it's all just very unhelpful for South Africa at our particular point in our cycle.
All right, so given those, and maybe you can also pick up on this as well, Gina, is we're also a part of the BRICS conglomerate. We're part of the economic partners in BRICS. Is there going to be any expectation on us which might add another layer of pressure?
Well, the last time we saw something like this in 2014, South Africa did not put sanctions in place. So let's put it that way. But what I wanted to add to what Kevin was saying is that both then from the trade and inflation perspective, I mean, it's absolutely correct. Our trade relations with the UK, the Ukraine and Russia are incredibly small. But what we never know about trade, and believe me, economists don't always know everything, is the second order of trade. And that's where Europe and Germany become very important here, because we trade a lot with Europe and Germany. Well, Germany being obviously within Europe. And how that impacts those economies may then, through a second derivative, start to impact us from a trade perspective. So that's a big unknown, and that's something we all try and figure out. So Germany is a very important trading partner for South Africa. And if their growth goes down as a result of this, well then they won't be able to trade as much with us. So that's already one of those risks from the trade perspective, but very difficult to try and work out those second order trade relations. From an inflation perspective, you'll often hear that, well, South Africa's inflation is relatively more contained than most other emerging markets and global countries at the moment. Even though it's up, it's not exploding like in a lot of places. And that's because of our weak demand and what they call the output gap, right? However, without getting too technical, our CPI basket is made up half of goods inflation, so food and fuel mostly, and then half of services. Services is running at 3% year on year at the moment, incredibly low, mostly because that's where we see the low demand. Goods inflation is where the oil price is coming through. And if you think about that CPI basket, it might be 50-50 nationally. For low-income individuals, it's not 50-50. So the more the oil price goes up, low-income individuals have far more sensitive CPI baskets to oil prices because of fuel prices. This gets even worse. These individuals don't have the luxury of driving a car. So when the petrol price eventually goes down, they don't benefit from it. Taxi fares go up, and when the fuel price goes down, they just stay stagnant. So the risk here is that the inflation concerns from the oil price creates the low-income space, which we know is already very frustrated, even more frustrated. And that could lead to more wage demands, which then in turn starts to become more inflationary, depending on unit labor costs. So, Kevin's right. We must not underestimate what this is becoming as an obstacle for South Africa through 2020.
Sorry, could I just come in there and say, it seems to me that the rand-dollar exchange rate hasn't really priced that in, because the rand has been remarkably strong.
It's done brilliant.
Well, two things. Commodity prices are still holding up.
Yeah.
There is also a view of Russia producing a lot of palladium. So when they can't produce it anymore or trade it, then of course the palladium price goes up, which makes our palladium terms of trade look very good. But there is also another, within the EM space, South Africa is probably the best of a bad bunch at the moment, right? People can't play Turkey because of their problems, and they certainly can't play Russia. So they effectively then, the same flows that would usually go that way get spread between Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, so we naturally become a recipient of flows that we wouldn't otherwise get. But it's almost artificial in nature. And sometimes that's a problem, because it gives our government this fake signal that actually, oh, well, look at the currency. It's not reacting to the budget.
Yeah.
The currency is doing fine. We're stable. Everyone says we're resilient. We must be doing a great job. No, it's because other people are doing a worse job.
Okay, and that's key, because I can tell you again, for myself as a layperson, when I look at the currency strengthening, for me it's a hip hip hooray, because I don't know what to look out for. I don't know, the right questions to ask, and it's probably possibly similar for a lot of citizens in our country. But unless, again, and that for me is what's so remarkable about this conversation and why it's important we have platforms like this, is because you signpost us to look a little bit closer at the data and to ask a lot more critical questions about things that we would ordinarily peg in our inventory of assessment. These are the reasons why South Africa is doing well. We've got this, and that. But actually, as you say, if it's not a consequence of our own actions and deliberate actions or policies that we're making, then we have a real problem and we have to be a lot more critical. I want to sort of, towards the latter end of our conversation, talk a little bit more about growth and opportunities for growth, if not within, the Treasury and our financial instruments, then where? And an issue that people who are listening online are talking about is leadership. It all goes back to that. And actually, I was at a BDO roundtable a couple of months ago, I think December or November, where this was a massive issue that we talked about also with the Statistician General and with former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel. Why are we asking that same question over and over again? And to empower ourselves, what do we need to do to make sure that something gives? So I'm gonna come back. So please booknote or footnote that for me, Munir. But this is what people in the audience are saying and asking. I love what Peter says. He says, no, please, not sin taxes. It's the wrong word. Please use the term health tax, because that's what it really is. I'm just going to not say anything because I've been a little bit naughty. And Graham says, have sin taxes really increased? Were they not just adjusted for inflation in the main?
4.5 to 6.5% within that band. That's the increase for tobacco and alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's largely in line with inflation.
Yeah.
It's not an overall increase, I don't believe.
Okay, that's interesting. You have a perspective on that as well?
Yeah, I think it's slightly above inflation, isn't it? Because you think 5-6%, I think, David, that's what they were talking about. So I think they pushed it a little bit. I actually think they went slightly higher where they could on it.
It's very marginal. Yeah.
Okay,
It's
well,
roughly inflation.
Okay,
Maybe
cool.
slightly above.
What is interesting, though, is that there was a big call from the lobbying group to say that they wanted no increases on that, and they obviously listened to the road accident, and they didn't have a fuel levy increase. But when it comes to the tobacco industry as well as the alcohol industry, they listened, but they done nothing about it, and they persevered ahead per normal.
But also, you can't, how can you have a fuel levy right now with petrol prices doing what they're currently doing? And at the same time, Treasury also again reminded us, because we spoke about this last year, you would have heard the Finance Minister coming out talking about a review of the fuel price in South Africa and looking at the retail and wholesale margins to see if they can do something there in order to try and just restructure it so that when oil prices do suddenly skyrocket, it's not felt as much, especially again by that low to middle income group.
Just to add, 30 to 40% of the taxes 30 to 40% goes into taxes when you pay your fuel levy. So they try to, by actually not increasing it this year, it was as high as 40%, but it's come slightly down to 30%. So you're still paying 30% in taxes when you fill up your car.
Okay, we're going to have to take less holidays or less road trips then. I want to put this question to, and anyone can really take it, I suppose, maybe Gina or Kevin. Fanig Loco says, we are, after all, a commodity-rich country. How do the taxes collecting from mining as a percentage of total collections compare to the 60s when the economy was strong?
I'll give you the 60s question, Kevin.
So they're not as... So last year was exceptional. The year we've gone through from the mining revenue is exceptional, and it's exceptional by a long way. In other words, the average is quite a bit lower than that. If you go back to the 60s, remember that back then gold was 50% of our export revenue. And gold mining, we used to have a separate category. I'm showing my age now, but you used to have a separate category in the tax data, the budget, just for gold mining tax, because it was that critical, it was that big a focus. And there was a huge amount of revenue derived from the mining industry, way more than what is the case on average now, right? So we've become significantly less dependent on mining in general. If you look at it as a percentage of this economy, it's probably about 7-8% of the economy. It doesn't contribute in terms of employment, etc., the same amount it used to. Where it makes still a significant difference is we remain a commodity exporter. And so mining or commodities comprise probably 30-40% of our total exports at this stage. And it's broadened out. It used to be mostly gold. Now it's platinum and iron ore and coal. And So we've done reasonably well in broadening that out. But I think going forward, don't anticipate this mining tax revenue staying necessarily this high. It'll stay high in the short term because you've still got a commodity price effect. So it's not like it's gone away, it's still there. And commodity prices are still doing okay. But my suspicion is over time, economic growth around the world will slow, the commodity cycle will ease off, and the mining revenue won't be as buoyant, and then we're going to have to look at other areas again.
Because what we haven't seen is reinvestment of those profits.
In South Africa.
Yes, and but for exactly the same reasons when we spoke about FDI.
Yeah.
You know, the mines look at South Africa and say, well, this is a nice windfall. It's higher profitability, but are we going to reinvest it in capex and wage bills? Well, no, because we're not sure about the economic future, and we're very worried about the types of interventions from government within the mining sector.
But just look back for me, if you will, in times when South Africa was doing relatively better than we are in this period, was that a practice that was happening, or was it just always sort of capital outflows?
No, we have in the past seen more reinvestment of commodity price booms as such than we're seeing right now, which again makes sense. I mean, 10 years ago, we did not think that, you know, our 5-year outlook on South Africa was not as bearish as it is right now. So that's generally the answer to the question.
So the mines at the moment, if you speak to the mines, they'll say there's no point investing because if I mine more stuff, what am I going to do with that more stuff? I can't put it on a railway line because the railway line is at 100% capacity and sometimes it breaks. I can't get it through the port system because the port system's at 100% capacity and sometimes it breaks. So if I invest in more production, I'm going to sit with a bigger stockpile of commodities that I can't do anything with. So there's no point investing, and then every now and again I won't have electricity. So the mines are generating brilliant profits, but we're not seeing the impact of that on investment, production, employment, and a revitalization of the mining industry, which is what you would want at this stage. Yeah. And obviously, over the years, we haven't taken mining and beneficiated those products. In other words, added downstream production to that mining. And so you get an event like this where commodity prices are elevated, and it does provide a windfall, but it's a missed opportunity. I look at the mining data. You must have a look at mining production data. And it's just a flat line. During a massive commodity boom, the production, volume of output is just flatlining. It's just not growing at all.
So it's just a price effect.
So you're getting the price benefit, but no volume, no investment, no employment effect.
Which brings us then, again, to this theme of looking at things a little more critically and a little more beneath the surface. I want to end on the leadership note because I think that's the correct note to end on, so we'll pin that for a moment. Let's talk about growth. South Africans want to grow. Individual families, to the point that you raised earlier, want to feel like, they can go to school, get a great education, graduate, get a higher education maybe, or a job or a vocation, and play a role in this economy. That band you referenced earlier about youth unemployment, staggering, depending on how you add up the sums. The upper echelons or the upper 70s is where that unemployment lies. Expanded definition, I think, of employment, again, around the 46.4% mark. And there's no opportunity for how we're going to reverse that. At least we don't know about it. So we're in this environment where there's a lot of news, there are a lot of signs to make us disconcerted and a little bit negative about what we can do. And what we strive to do in these conversations is to end on a can do. So where does growth come from? Where can growth come from?
Munir, Ron, who wants to take that?
It's a difficult one. I'll give the academic view.
And Munir's writing his PhD, by the way. Isn't that cool?
So I think it's partnering with big business. We didn't see a lot of that coming through. The president mentioned a little bit of that in his speech. So I think a big business has to come aboard. We need to create jobs again. We need to, I always said that the solution to our problems is education firstly. We need to skill our people, and we need to equip them and prepare them for the work environment. But when they get to the environment, there has to be jobs. Government need to also start spending. There was no mention yesterday, a lot of their capex expenditure is put on hold. And they can't. I can understand that they can't They can't continue with their spending the way they want to at the moment, but there comes a time where they're going to have to start spending again. When's the last time we built something? In the World Cup, isn't it? The stadiums. Right? It is a white elephant at the moment. But we need to create that. We need to start building, creating jobs, creating the infrastructure again. And you need business aboard, and you need government leadership. We spoke about that. We need leadership aboard, but we need them to work together. And it's when they start ticking together that ultimately we see the jobs becoming available, and suddenly we turn the corner. Slowly you migrate and you turn the corner.
I mean, but what does sticking together look like? I mean, we saw obviously more incentives around, employment and labor for companies. So there's one. We had, the president hold that thought. We saw the president in Sona saying, toss the ball over to the private sector. That's where job creation and, sort of job growth is going to come from. What are the tangible signs of that?
We need to help businesses. I think we need to go and look at where they're struggling. There's a lot of issues at the moment with SARS, with just filing tax returns, compliance, getting your CIPC returns, regulation. Let's free them up from the day-to-day regulation that they tied up, with the burden that they tied up. And let's them do what they're supposed to do, make money, and employ people and create the jobs. At the moment, they're busy with admin. That's what big businesses are stuck with at the moment. And I think we need to soften that red tape that businesses are stuck with. Yesterday the only mention, by the way, about SMEs was in the budget speech, nothing in the detailed documents. Absolutely nothing about actually supporting the small businesses to one day become big businesses, so that they can become the employers of the big employers of tomorrow. It was only a little bit about how can we fund these small businesses, but nothing big, nothing concrete coming to. We need that to tick together. We need them to talk together and start working in tandem to the same solution, and we're not seeing it, Iman.
I heard David take a breath, so I'll give you first, and Jean, I know you want to come back.
No, I just want to say, I think small business is very important. It's not only about large business. So, there is an initiative to help funding small businesses where access to finance has been a real issue for them. And now there's an initiative where government will help banks by underwriting, I think it's 20% of debt incurred by small business to give them access to funding. So it certainly is a start. That's a start, and it's going to help. But definitely red tape. There's a lot of red tape, and you see it all over the place. I see it most often with tax and dealing with SARS. So there was quite encouraging news around SARS. I think that they seem to be getting better. There's a lot of money. There's 430 billion rand going into SARS for the IT infrastructure to beef that up. The large business centre has opened up again. SARS Exco are now being held to account in performance reviews. So they're quite encouraging things. They're going to go after errant taxpayers. But the other side of that coin, which we sometimes see, is that people that are entitled to, for example, refunds, the money is just held back and held back and held back by SARS for no reason whatsoever. They go through audit after audit and they audit the same thing. And they come to the conclusion they're entitled to a refund, and then it's reversed. And then there's another audit that starts. And so one's got to be efficient at collecting taxes, and hopefully SARS is going to do that, because you don't have to raise the rate of tax to collect more tax as long as you can make SARS more efficient.
Yeah. Well, I would say there has to be, some empathy, especially when you deal with a smaller business. I'm a small business. It's a confusing terrain when it comes to red tape, when it comes to funding, when it comes to SARS itself. And I consider myself a fairly clever person, but I haven't been able to hack my own strategy when it comes to it. And I imagine how many other small businesses die by the wayside. They already have the burden of working in a very sort of recessionary environment almost, not a lot of know-how about how these things operate. A lot more outreach and evangelism needs to happen from SARS's perspective, even with these support instruments for small businesses, and I count myself in that number. All right, so Gina, I know that you also wanted to come
Yeah,
back
I
in.
was just eye-rolling at the employment discussion, only because how many budgets have we seen where you go and you count up the number of jobs that everything's supposed to create, but yet now the unemployment rate officially is 35%. And only then is it a crisis. It was a crisis when it was 20%. And then even when it came out at 35%, it was a crisis for about a week, and then it kind of just got shoved away again. And that's where I think the small business discussion really comes in, but this is where it gets tricky. And just hear me out so I don't sound too controversial.
No,
But
we love controversy. Go for it.
there are barriers of entries that are so high for small businesses. If you think about it, and this again, you're going to hear the word inefficiency so much through this conversation we're having, because let's think about inflation. Inflation is a lovely way to look at every economy. Inflation is the function of inefficiencies. So the more inefficient your economy is, the higher your inflation rate is. Think about an inefficient power station. If it's inefficiently run, you're going to need higher tariffs. That's how you get the inflation.
And we
coming
see
through.
that happening already.
But so your cost of doing business is so high in South Africa, right? And what we've seen, and I'm in no way going against big business here, but big business has the economies of scale. They can weather storms. And what we saw, to just give you an active example here in South Africa, in 2017, all the big retailers in South Africa finally cottoned on to the fact that, actually this economy is not going back to 3% growth. Actually, the consumer is not as strong as we thought it was. So we need to do some very clever things with our economies of scale to drop our operating costs, so make ourselves efficient because we're so large, we can afford to do so that we can weather the storm and not pass through so much inflation. So we can push volumes, we can do lots of clever things in our pricing strategies. Versus a small retailer, and to use a very extreme example, imagine you're a Neisner fishing rod store and you import your fishing rods and suddenly the currency depreciates. Can you just sell more fishing rods to offset that? No, you can't. And that's because you have no control over these inefficiencies in South Africa that are largely caused by government, that are causing the type of higher cost of business that is hitting your margin. And it's not just a final point so that no one comes and tells me I'm anti-big business. Again, the strategy here is not to go for big business in this regard and make them, unwind all their efficiencies in order to drop the barriers of entry. The trick here is to create accountability in government to create more efficiencies so small businesses can flourish.
Yeah, and it goes back again to the leadership question, which I'm going to want to end on in just a moment. But Meneer, growth for you, where do you see it happening?
Yeah, I think we need to create jobs again. Like I said, I think it goes back to the drawing board. We need to go back to the drawing board. We need big businesses to come aboard. We need small businesses. We need to support them in every way, shape, and form. So like I said, tomorrow they're going to become the big businesses and they're going to be the big employers. So whatever we can do in unblocking and making it easy for them to trade, try and register a company. See how difficult it is. Try and file a tax return, like David is saying, and go through the number of audits that you're going to. For a small business, that is a big headache, like Gina is saying. For big business, they can sort it out. They've got scale of economies. They can deal with the admin. A small business gets derailed, and before you know it, the business closes. So we need to support small businesses as much as we can.
I'm going to be cheeky and probably not get invited back to BDO next year. But David, I was going to say, we should have a BDO Friends of the Small Business Unit, that on a certain day at a certain time offers people like myself free advice, and we'll just guide you and be your Sherpas through this rocky and prickly terrain of, tax collection and how you keep things, how you do management accounts and things like that. Anyway, all right, do you have a view, maybe David as well, on areas of growth? This is certainly a piece that, if you were sitting in the same room with Enoch Godongwana and his entire technical team and saying, you know what, you missed a tick there, look over here.
Well, I think, South Africa's, we've still got some advantages because we've still got some very good skills at a relatively cheap price by world standards. So, for example, and I think now of outsourced services where we can be a hub for work and professional service type work that's done in the rest of the world and in Europe and in the US, and That's one example of sort of maximizing the skills that we've got. We've got a lovely climate, so we should be a great source of energy production, green energy production. And it's held back by policy issues, unfortunately. So that's an example of where government actually gets in the way, I think. And then we've also got tourism. So there are different sectors that we're naturally good at, and I think we should try and play in those sectors and try and maximize those. But you do need the skills, you need the enabling environment so that businesses can invest and feel confident in investing within the areas, within those sectors that we're good at in order to create the growth. And that's where government, leadership and government has got to play such a fundamental role.
Yeah. And if you were in the Clarity Roundtable in November, two of those themes came up quite strongly. It was around municipal, fiscal transparency and having all their books up to speed. And leadership was also a big key there. And that's one of the points that Zach, for example, is reflecting on, saying we're back to the old discussion on getting the right skills from the municipal level up. Government needs to attract the right skills. It's not as easy as they are competing with the private sector. Innovative ideas are needed. Again, yes, you do. You do need the right people with the right skills in those positions to be able to do the right job and do an effective job of it. But if you're looking at, things like the Great Resignation, or particularly in the digital arena, a lot of skills drain from people who now are suddenly more viable in different economies and can leave South Africa and go somewhere else. How do we get that right then? I don't know if you have a view on that, Munir.
It's so difficult, Iman, because I teach and I'm dealing with the students that are about to leave the CTA class and become chartered accountants. And this is a group of people I talk to, and I tell them you need to go into government to fix it up. And they don't want to because it's uncomfortable. It's
what did you say, Kevin?
Who would want to go there?
It's strange that they don't want to leave and go into government.
Why would they want to go there when they can go into a cozy corporate environment and there's no pressure to fix and things are actually working? So they go into a comfortable, soft landing rather than taking the difficult route, which we all would have done. We all would have done it. But I think this is where, for example, accounting bodies can come aboard. The psychos of the world, the CIPAs of the world. The doctors go through this sort of apprenticeship as well, and it's been talked about, where we need to upskill. We need to partner. The bodies need to partner with the municipalities and get the accounting right. Accountants are good at getting the accounts right, and we need to get those guys into the municipalities and train the guys up, at least, if not working there, and getting the accounts so that when you get your municipality bill, it's not 100,000 rand. It is the few thousand that you actually owe.
Is that happening at all? I mean, it's purely voluntary.
At the moment, there are partnerships between SAICA and that I'm aware of in terms of support structures and programs that they've got with with upskilling the CFOs as well. There's a program going on, but I think more of that needs to happen. That needs to be accelerated to the level where that we get full-on efficiency, we get government efficiency. Think about it. In the UK, you would want to go and work for a government department. It's an employable. It's seen upon as a good job opportunity. It's security. It's everything. Here, opposite.
Yeah, but that's still a developed market. Again, just remember that.
Apples with apples.
I was about to say that it's a fantastic idea, but you then need accountability coming from the top, because there will be some municipalities, and the last thing they want is some really good article clerks coming in there and actually sifting through their books and cleaning them up, because the things that they will find, that becomes quite dangerous. Right? We haven't even spoken about corruption this morning. And unfortunately, you get a lot of corruption on a municipal level. And you basically need to protect those article clerks then.
So those inefficiencies, you would say, are sometimes by design, or deliberate, or by design, so that people can get away with it?
No, we know there's corruption, and we know there's wasteful expenditure because of that.
It's a sensitive issue to put them there.
Yeah. No, it's just that's where, you talk about leadership, that's where the national government needs to put something in place in order to allow and facilitate the cleaning up of municipal books.
But what is that something? Because we have a lot of retrospective actions, we have a series of task teams, we have a series of, putting provinces under administration. We've got a series of, inquiries, investigative panels that we do in South Africa. What can we do that's different?
When did we last fire an underperforming minister? We don't. There's a sneaky conversation. Sometimes they resign, they step down, but firing unaccountable individuals starts to set a tone.
Would you agree? So, as we kind of set up towards the end, and again, if I reflect on panels we've hosted before, is we're always in some kind of crisis situation or the other in a year where we might have record levels of unemployment and say, wow, this is the first time in 13 years these numbers have hit so high. We keep setting more and more ignominious benchmarks for ourselves as South Africa. We think about growth. We were hitting, double-digit targets in terms of growth are unicorns to us now. If we can get 5 to 7, we're very, very happy. And this year we're not even close, possibly close to 2%, possibly even less. So what needs to give? We've spoken about the leadership question, again, in many, many panels. People will say, well, the obvious route is that you need to vote. The other obvious route is we need to be more of a friend to public sector, institutions. How do we skills transfer? How do we get motivated? You mentioned the South Korean example, and if I just reflect on South Korea with regard to their own IMF loan, taxi drivers' wives were melting down their dowry, their gold dowries to be able to service the national debt. How do we begin to get into that phase of, okay, we're a little bit buggered, things aren't great. Leadership needs to change, but as citizens, we also need to get involved. How do we do that practically?
I think it's quite a difficult question because you need a citizenry that is committed to making things right. I don't think that it's really should be the responsibility of the citizens to actually themselves fix things. It's the government's responsibility that the citizens voted for to actually create that enabling environment. So citizens can, at the sort of micro level, do stuff and commit time and help with skills transfers and so forth. But you can't expect them. There's no legal obligation on them to do so. And it really comes down, I think, to the politics that we've got in the country, where you've got one very dominant party that seems to be undergoing its own problems, but it still is so dominant that it's very difficult. It can almost, you get the sense it can do what it likes. So
you're saying that there's some levels of impunity there, or?
I think that there is. I think without doubt there is, and I think that the statements that were made by the former president, where he said that the ANC will rule until Jesus comes back, that type of mindset is I think indicative of that, and it's quite unfortunate. I think things are doubtless better under the new president, but it takes more than one or two people to actually change the mindset of the whole government, which is quite inefficient and quite, dare one say, corrupt, as has been found in the Zondo reports.
Kevin?
So go back to when we had what you've just described. Go back to when that was evident in South Africa, and that was in the years leading up to the Soccer World Cup. That level of enthusiasm about the country, about where it was going, about job creation, about South Africa's prospects was impressive back then. It's no surprise that environment also corresponded with a record level of business confidence ever recorded in this country. And you can say that the Soccer World Cup was the catalyst. It brought everybody together, it gave us a common focus. We seemed to be delivering for that, and there was a lot of enthusiasm and showcase in South Africa. But I would argue that what was really happening was that when you walked outside, you saw stuff being developed. The fact that it was a stadium was not the important thing. It could have been something else, but you saw something happening. And by seeing cranes, seeing work activity, seeing renewal, seeing cleanup, you become enthused. So if I was government, that's what I would borrow from that. I've got to make this very visible to the citizens, right? So how would I do it? If I've got just 3 minutes, let me just give you a snapshot of how I would do this, okay?
I love it when Kevin leans forward. Something exciting is about to happen.
So employment, so when you listen to a speech by a government official in South Africa, particularly if it's a provincial official, what he or she will think they have to do is to tell you that they've got many, many priorities. I've listened to a speech where the person says, I've got 21 priorities for this year, okay? And as soon as you say that, you've got no priority. By definition, if you've got 21, you've got none, right? And the president of this country does the same thing. Here are our top 9 priorities. So what I would do is I'd make one priority. That's it, one. And that priority would be job creation. And every other policy has to be subservient to that one policy, every other policy. And the reason is that as soon as you create jobs, you give me an economic problem, give me a social problem, give me a problem in this country. And as soon as you create jobs, that problem will get less. I don't care what it is. Whether it's inequality, paying for education, paying for medical, worrying about your retirement, every problem will get less as I create more jobs. So make job creation your top priority. Massively improve your understanding of employment. We survey employment once a quarter in this country, and Gina will tell you we hardly believe the data. The US will tell us employment data once a week. Once a week. Why do they do that? Then they follow that up with once a month, once a quarter. It's just perpetual employment data. Why do they do that? They recognize how important employment is to the prospects of the economy. So make employment your number one priority. Make the survey of employment equally as important so you know what's going on. Now, how do you create jobs in any country? There's only one way to create jobs. You've got to invest. And you can't grow an economy unless you create jobs. You find me an economy that is prosperous with no job creation. It doesn't exist. You're barely growing, which is what the problem is here. So if we want economic growth, we've got to recognize that that is driven by job creation, and we've got to recognize that job creation is driven by investment, right? So then we say we want business to invest, small business to invest, big business to invest. They won't invest. If you go to big business now and you say to them invest, they'll say to you, why? I've got spare capacity. What am I investing for? Why am I going to go spend millions on something? What for? I don't need that capacity. You're not going to get investment, right? Government can't invest, they've got no money. So what's the solution? If you want to grow an economy, you need a balance sheet. You cannot grow anything. You can't grow a business, you can't grow an economy without a balance sheet. Who in this country has a balance sheet? Government has a wrecked balance sheet. The SOEs don't have a balance sheet. Households can't think of a balance sheet. They hardly save any money. The only entity with a decent balance sheet in this country is the corporate sector, but they've lost confidence. So what's the solution? Government wants to drive the economy. Corporates have the balance sheet. Get those two to work together, which is private-public partnerships. So what you've got to do is take the independent power producer program, which I think has been successful, and roll that out to every entity. Why don't you do water, independent power producer, sewage, independent power producer, railways, harbors, do it on a PPP, private-public partnership basis. Is the private sector interested in that investment? Hell yes. At Stanlib, we've got money. What's our biggest problem? Finding projects to invest? It's not a problem of money.
That's a good problem to have.
It's a good problem. We've got the money. We're looking for projects. So why doesn't government do that, right? Because of ideology. As soon as you talk to government and you say, partner with the private sector, get the private sector involved in all of this, allow them to use the railways, allow them to produce energy. The ideology within the ANC, with a communist and COSATU backing, pushes back against that. So ultimately what holds this country back is an ideology of the government. And what they need to do and recognize, and it's difficult, is they need to get out of the way, do what they actually can do, and allow the private sector to get involved on a partnership basis and use that as the catalyst. And once you do that, you drive around and you see water being developed, sewage being developed. It'll have exactly the same effect as the Soccer World Cup. You'll be enthused, you'll see stuff happening, and then you as a private citizen will want to invest.
And what's interesting about that is the contagion effect. I don't know if you guys remember in 2010, just seeing a South African flag from somebody else's window. I mean, you didn't even know the person. you suddenly, you bought into the zeitgeist or the spirit of South Africa at that time. But practically speaking, I don't know, who agrees with what Kevin is saying, that this seems to be a 1, 2, 3 step to success? And really, maybe just a quick show of hands in the room?
When you're stuck
Okay,
in traffic in
pretty unanimous.
Johannesburg because the traffic light isn't working because government can't fix it, how happy do we get when we see our insurance people busy starting to get involved?
Yeah,
And we all
I
go,
give them rounds of
"Thank you."
applause. Hey guys,
There's the
just
private
trying to-
sector getting
yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah, very practical, but as you say, if you scale that sort of, a partnership, the opportunities to do good things are exponential. I'm going to come to the peer review in just a moment. I just want to share a comment from the audience. And Karini Rasmus says, in reference to my earlier question, in terms of job creation, do you think that ring fencing the carbon tax could potentially contribute to managing the social risks of our just energy transition? Anyone want to jump on that really quickly before I move on?
So again, Iman, they've got a policy. Treasury's got a policy of not ring fencing. The budget says to be, you got to determine or put forward a proposal as to why you want that budget, but they don't ring fence taxes and actually ring fence it for specific targeted expenditure. So we follow a different philosophy, if you want to call it, in terms of our budget spend. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. We've talked about ring fencing, for example, the sugar tax, and actually keeping it within that industry itself, and ring fencing and circulating it and making sure it turns over. But again, from a policy point of view, they stuck on a certain policy and a trajectory, and they only implement that accordingly. So they will not detract from that.
I hope you were covered there, Karin. And then Margaret says, not a question, but I want to add to the comment of offering small businesses free advice. This is a great suggestion, and I want to add a practical solution to incentivize the initiative. What if the professional accounting bodies offering CPD points for some pro bono hours? The red tape, SARS, CIPC, etc. is not only expensive and time-consuming, but also intimidating for young entrepreneurs. I may not be young, but I'm in that category also of being, it's a very intimidating environment, Margaret, thank you. With the guidance of professional accountants, there will be a higher success rate for these small businesses. I couldn't concur even more. And it is a big...
Is she a family member?
Listen, Kevin, I didn't invite people from my family to come on the conversation today, but it is an important point because, what is the stats? It just escapes me at the moment, but small business is a massive driver to, it can be have the potential as being a massive driver of the economy. Last time I checked, and I could be wrong, was encroaching the 70% mark or something, but I might be off on the stats. So offering the support is not a feel-good, philanthropic, altruistic thing to do. It is deeply practical and it can make a significant impact to our economy. All right, so Munir, growth.
Yeah, I think,
Or did I ask you the growth question?
Leadership, growth.
Leadership and growth. I think, as chartered accountants, we build to see solutions where other people see problems. That's what that's the definition, the simple definition of a chartered accountant. And I think, like Kevin has said, there are so much problems in the country at the moment. We need to start seeking solutions to that problem. So electricity, service delivery, all those issues. But the problem is government needs to come aboard. That's what we need. We need them to unblock the red tape, where they're blocking at the moment small businesses who's got great ideas, great potential. They want to actually, they've got ideas, there's solar energy companies that want to start producing solar and feeding back into the grid. It's blocked at the moment from a regulation point of view. So there are, in fact, we're in a good position because we've got so much of problems. All the solutions are going to create jobs. We just have to implement the plan. But
that's
it's
so
not
interesting,
happening.
taking that perspective, to see the problems as opportunities to be inventive and resourceful.
Yeah.
You wanted to say more?
No.
Got you.
No, so maybe off the back of that, to think about, today's the 24th of February. Okay,
Yeah.
so I can still use this. 2 years ago, if we were all sitting here, and I'd said to you all, hey, guess what? A global pandemic's about to hit next month. We're going to be locked in our houses for 90 days. We're going to experience wave after wave of this virus. We're all going to have masks on. The economy is going to contract 6.5%. We would have all just gone, okay, that's it, we're gone. This economy is going to explode. It basically can't exist after that. But it did exist. And it existed because we still do have very good leadership in some areas. The South Africa Reserve Bank, to a degree, also National Treasury. I know that they've lost some of that, but they still are institutionally strong. A lot of support from business too, that helped us get through this. So we need to recognize that leadership. But then it also exposed so many of our vulnerabilities. And the exposing of those vulnerabilities should be used as an opportunity, like you correctly say, to say, we can't handle another shock like this. We absolutely need to start putting things in place to guard us against something that could happen, even if it's half of what the pandemic was. We cannot end up in a space once again where the unemployment rate just rapidly gets worse and worse and worse. So I think we can take the last 2 years to recognize where our strengths lie and also what has exposed us on our vulnerabilities in order to try and correct that, not with new ideas. We must just do the things we've always said we would do. Confidence snaps back very quickly, actually. If you think back to last year, when they announced embedded generation, I think it's the only time I've actually heard South Africa underpromise and overdeliver. Confidence shot up so much immediately after that, and then, oh, now we can't do anything because of wheeling policy. So again, politics getting in the way of private sector desperately wanting to get involved. So you need to be incredibly strategic now about all these reform measures because we've been promising them for so long, not delivering for so long. Everything, by the time it happens, like Spectrum, everyone's like, well, finally, instead of saying hip, hip, hooray. So we need to try, you've all heard that term, and I can't stand it, the low-hanging fruit, because if it's so low-hanging, it's rotten on the floor by now, but it's been hanging there for so long. But by doing that, in small steps along the way, you buy yourself time to then really tackle the big, big reforms such as Eskom and energy. Because even the IMF says reform takes 2 years to get you, the growth enhancements to your economy that you need from it. So even if we start today, we're only going to see the fruits of this in 2 years' time, minimum. So we need to do the small things along the way. Please just announce the e-visas. Get the highly skilled visas sorted out properly. Get Spectrum announced, even if it's something that we've been eye-rolling now for the last 3 years. Just do that so that at least you're able to tick some boxes along the way. And lean very hard on that leadership that has stood us in such good stead. The South Africa Reserve Bank, they play such an unbelievably important role when it comes to price stability. We've spoken so much about the oil price, about inflation, about low-income individuals needing income, but income gets eaten up by inflation. Leave the SARB alone. Let them do what they need to do. Believe me, what they have done for us over the last 5 years of getting inflation expectations from 6 to 4.5%, I don't think anyone gives them sufficient credit for that. So let those institutions continue to lead, and then please just do some small things while you start at the same time tackling the big things down the line.
Yeah, it's incremental changes that, together have a major impact. Thanks for that, Gina. I have just one final piece of work for everyone who's on the call, and that is to please fill in our survey. And I know they're going to be all fives because this panel was absolutely amazing, and I certainly learned a lot today. What I'm also thinking is if there have been any blind spots, anything you want really quickly tackled, answered, I'll just do a quick look around the room. Anyone, are you all covered? Okay, we have one in the front row. Let's get a microphone over here, please, Londi. Thank you.
Hi, it's Bert. A lot of what we've discussed is the formal sector.
Can I ask you to just raise your volume just a little bit for us, please?
I hope it's on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better.
We've spoken really about what we know, the formal sector. There's a massive informal sector and how that contributes to the economy. I know the unemployment stats are referred to as 35%, 40%, but understand if you actually throw in the informal sector, those factors decrease quite a bit. And nothing's really been mentioned there. We had the tax increases, you're talking about tax increases, VAT. Wasn't that one of the reasons why the VAT didn't really increase that much in terms of the revenue to the fiscus? Because we're an exporting country and also the economy is very informal to an extent, or maybe becoming more informal. And what's the impact of that going forward?
All right, anyone on that one? Munir, maybe?
Sure. Difficult question, but Iman, I'll try. I think the informal sector, more than half of the population is currently in some way or shape or form on some social grants, right? And what Bert is alluding to, we need to get those people out of that rut as well. We need to, exactly the point that we've been talking about, we need to create jobs for them. We're spending 400 billion in educating the nation. But there's no jobs on the other end when they come out from the universities. We see this all the time. They struggle. Chartered accountants sometimes struggle to get a job today. And the problem is that there's not sufficient workforce. We're not creating that hype, that positivity, that solve the problem effect that, there's a lot of work out there. If we don't have to, Gina spoke about it. It's a low-hanging fruit. You don't have to go and look for it. It's hanging there. We just need government to come to the party to unblock those red tapes and change their policy thinking and decision making. And that will bring along, slowly. And I do believe one change that the universities must do is that we've lost the ability to go technical. We've all gone very academic. Back in the days there were technicons, there was a guy with a bucky and his four guys, and they actually came and they done your plumbing job and they made money. And they ticked the economy, and slowly before you knew it, he was a little big business or small business, and then he was a big business. What happened to those guys? We're not supporting those guys. Those are the guys that we need to go and tap into, the artisans again. We're all about academics at the moment. We're all about PhDs and ticking the boxes. We spoke about it. But what about that? The technical people that we all need. When your washing machine breaks at home, you need to phone someone. That's the people we need to get back, and we need to get and tap those people and get them working and get the labor force going.
Any other ideas on activating or, factoring in the sector of the economy in,
Yeah, so small business is very meaningful in this country. We try and survey. It is surveyed in the employment data. It is surveyed in some industries. So Stats SA tries to evaluate it. We know that there's a very rapid urbanization going on still into the major metros, and we know that some of that, or quite a lot of that, ends up in the informal sector. I don't know, Gina might have a different number. My sense is it's probably about 12-15% of this economy in total, and that's meaningful. The difficulty with it is that it's highly inefficient. It doesn't contribute to the tax base in a very significant way. It's not able to access credit. It's not able to take an informal set of activities and kind of give it a bit more structure, start to employ a few more people. So it's not as if you want to say, well, going forward, I need to create an even more vibrant, bigger informal sector. It's not actually ideal. What you want to do is to look at that informal sector and say, how do I create a sort of semi-formal where I take talent from that? And there's no doubt there's a mass amount of talent within that informal sector. And how do I bring them a bit more closer to the formal economy and give them opportunity? And that opportunity could well just be a bit of skill, a bit of credit, a bit of assistance with infrastructure, those sorts of things, and then I think you unlock a lot more value. So I'm not an advocate of let's go massive informal trading and informal. I think it can get out of hand, and I think it can get ugly. And I think there's a criminal element that can easily occupy that space. I don't think we want to go that route in South Africa, but I think there's massive opportunity that it represents.
All right, I'm going to leave it on that note, and I hope you're covered in that question. I just want to thank everyone for being with us. I didn't think 2 hours were going to just evaporate so quickly. I thought we were going to run out of things to say.
Neither did we.
Because I know that there's still a lot more that we could say. And that's the whole point about having discussions like these, is that they signposts into realizations, observations that you might want to probe a little bit more about. We've got some ideas of where else to look for new ideas. And so I really encourage you to do that. Don't forget to fill out the survey. We've got about a minute or so. So I'm putting my radio hat on. I'm going to be very strict, people. A 30, maybe 20-second just hot outtake as we bid our audience goodbye. David.
Okay, so I think that the budget, I would probably give it a 7 out of 10 if I were rating it, or somewhere around there. I think that the critical thing really is about growth. It's not so much about tax revenue. Tax revenue is, we've had the windfalls. There's no scope for raising more, except if there's growth, then of course we'll get more revenue. So it really comes down to that. And we need the political will to see through the changes that are being spoken about. The right kind of noises are being made by both the state president and by the finance minister yesterday, but we need the political will to see those implemented and to get growth going.
Thanks, David. Kevin.
So I would agree with that score, more or less about 7 or so out of 10. I think the budget did what it had to do within the current environment. And from here, it's all about policy implementation. Now, quickly, in 30 seconds, 20 seconds, before Enoch became Minister of Finance, and I'm calling Enoch because then it sounds like I know him. So before he became Minister of Finance, what was he doing? He was writing a lot of the policy documents. And he was instrumental in writing South Africa's Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, which is the current policy document. And when I last chatted to him, his takeaway from that document was all about implementation. I think that document is the right thing. I think it has the right emphasis. It's about implementing the policies we have on the table, and I'm hoping the Minister of Finance now will apply his mind not just to the budget strategy, but how do I get policy implemented?
Great. Meneer?
Iman, I agree with the score. Don't forget, in the context, in the bigger picture, a very difficult budget under trying circumstances. We're just coming out post-pandemic. Very, very difficult. I say this all the time. I've said it for the past 20 years. I'm giving my age away when I'm commenting on budgets. It is the most difficult budget. But this was the most difficult budget I had to comment on. So under the circumstances, he definitely came out very good. No tax increases, consolidation of budget spend.
Great.
Well, I'm going to give
Thanks,
it the
Meneer.
same score I had to give it a couple of times yesterday, which is 6.5 out of 10, which is 65% for an underperforming student. It's not a bad outcome, right? So I'm giving it to them because
You're always going to be a tough
distinction,
headmistress.
70%,
yeah, a good C plus for holding the line, but a lot of risks down the line too.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think you guys did a great job. Any deficiencies are all mine. These guys are fantastic. Go ahead and let's see if we can pick up that discussion on support for small business. BDO is such an amazing, I know, support system to small businesses, or can be. Thank you to everyone in the room. Thank you to everyone who's joining us online. And hopefully see you again a couple of months from now for the medium term budget speech. Take care, everyone, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks.